Remember, I used to talk about the polls, right? I used to talk about the polls, and I forgot about it because I won the primaries by so much I didn't have to talk about them.
Donald Trump did bring up some of the latest polls at a rally in North Carolina yesterday. That state critical for both Republicans and Democrats. And it, along with Georgia and Pennsylvania, could decide who gets the White House. So for more on the latest polls and some of the possible election night scenarios, I'm joined by David Wasserman. He's the senior editor and elections analyst at the Cook Political Report. David Wasserman, thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thank you.
So now less than 50 days from the election, where does national polling, your national polling average, put both candidates right now?
Well, Kamala Harris has taken about a 2.5-point lead in our average, and that's right on the bubble of where we think she needs to be in order to be able to win the Electoral College and thus the presidency. Keep in mind that in 2020, Joe Biden did win the popular vote by 4.5 points, but he only won the tipping point states by about 2/3 of a point. And so Kamala Harris may need to win by 2 or 3 points. And the polls in the battleground states, the 7 closest ones, show a race that couldn't be much tighter. Kamala Harris's best states appear to be Michigan and Wisconsin of those core 7. Donald Trump's states, his best states appear to be Arizona and North Carolina, but not by more than a point or so. The 2 states I really think will decide this race are Georgia and Pennsylvania.
Okay, interesting. So you talked about Harris being up, and certainly she has made up ground since becoming the nominee, but Trump doesn't seem to be losing ground. How do you explain that?
That's right. Despite all of his unforced errors in the past 2 months, and there have been many, his favorability has not taken much of a hit. He's at 43% favorable and 53% unfavorable in our internal average, and that's really unchanged from several months ago. Whereas Kamala Harris, she's gone from -16 to just -2, which is a pretty remarkable brand transformation. And it speaks to how much more effective Democrats have been at reintroducing her to voters than the Trump campaign.
I know one of the things that you're looking at is high engagement voters versus low engagement voters. And I imagine that's like just trying to get people to actually vote. But you can explain that to me, as well as how Kamala is tapping into those low engagement voters.
That's right. What we noticed back in May when we polled the 7 closest states was that among voters who turn out 100% of the time in federal elections, Joe Biden was ahead by 4, but Trump was leading by 10 points among everyone else. Today, Kamala Harris is still up by 4 among those 100% voters, but she's closed Trump's lead to just 3 among everyone else, which speaks to the fact that she's a much better pop culture candidate than Donald Trump. Also, keep in mind that according to Nielsen, 67 million Americans watched the first and probably only debate between Harris and Trump. That's less than half of the likely electorate that we're expecting this fall. It could be in the 155 to 160 million range. And that means that most Americans heard about the debate through snippets or sound bites or clips on the evening news. And if voters took one thing away from that debate, it was Donald Trump's assertion that people are eating dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio, rather than some of his more effective moments in questioning why Harris has not accomplished many of the policy goals she set out in the last 3.5 years.
That's kind of depressing that that's what everyone walked away from that night with, but I understand it. Give me right now your sort of 4 plausible scenarios that you're looking at in terms of what could happen on election day. Yeah.
Well, first of all, Kamala Harris could break through in the Sun Belt states. She is more competitive in North Carolina than Joe Biden ever was. She's narrowed the gap in North Carolina to about a point. And it doesn't help Republicans that their candidate for governor there is caught up in a massive scandal. Yeah. And that gubernatorial race is tanking. And so if she were to win Georgia and North Carolina and Arizona, that would be a very plausible route to 270 votes for her. The other side of the coin, and maybe throw in Michigan, which is her strongest Midwestern state. Right. The other side of the coin, though, is if Donald Trump realizes some of the gains that we're seeing in polls for him among Black and Hispanic and young voters, he could break through not just in North Carolina, which he's won twice, and Georgia and Arizona, but also Nevada, a state that he's never carried to date. That is one possibility for him. And then I'd say a third possibility is that there won't be a consistent pattern in the results, and we won't have a neat geographic divide between these battlegrounds. And one procedural fight that we're watching right now is in Nebraska, where Republicans are embarking on a last-minute push to convert Nebraska into a winner-take-all state. It's one of just two states at the moment that divide its electoral votes by congressional districts. That's important because if Kamala Harris were to win the Great Lakes battlegrounds of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, plus win that lone electoral vote from Omaha, Nebraska, that would put her just over the top. So Republicans are doing everything they can to ensure that she won't win that vote.
Okay, really fascinating stuff. We'll keep watching. Perhaps we'll have you back before the big night. Thanks so much, David Wasserman.
Thank you.
Let's talk more about the U.S. presidential election in our American Roundtable. With us today, Toluse Olorunnipa, White House bureau chief at The Washington Post, and Courtney Subramanian, supervising editor at BBC News in Washington. Hello to both of you. Okay, Toluse, I'll start with you. You heard there from David Wasserman about some of the latest polling numbers. Certainly, both campaigns out there courting younger, undecided men under the age of 50. Can you give me a sense of why that demographic is so important at this moment?
Well, there's a huge gender gap right now in this race in which Kamala Harris is doing very well with women. She's pulling away from Donald Trump, but Donald Trump is doing very well with men. And so among the undecided voters, a big chunk of them are young men, people who are, one, deciding whether or not to vote at all, people who are sort of lower engagement voters. Some of them are not planning to vote. Donald Trump has been making a big play at them, going on podcasts that are popular with young men, trying to convince people that voting for him is sort of the cool or new thing to do, presenting himself as the insurgent candidate. Kamala Harris is also trying to reach out to some of these men, specifically men of color, because she realizes that she's doing very well with Black women, very well with women of color, but not doing so well with men of color. And she's trying to increase those numbers in order to get to a place where she will be more competitive in states like Georgia and North Carolina and Pennsylvania, where you do have a large number of men who may or may not vote, and their vote could end up swinging the election.
Yeah, I mean, they're really targeting very specific demographics at this stage, given how close things are. Courtney, polls from the Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer suggest that Kamala Harris scored pretty well given the debate, but it hasn't really led to more support. She said she will do another debate on CNN. Donald Trump says it's too late. What do you think is the chances that could happen again, and what is her campaign looking to focus on?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you said, Donald Trump says he thinks it's too late. I think it's how much pressure is on the Trump campaign. My colleague was at his rally in North Carolina and spoke to some Trump supporters who said they also would like to see a second Trump-Harris debate. Will that happen? It remains to be seen. But I think the calculus for the Harris campaign and pushing for a second debate is to extend the momentum that she was able to build early in her campaign. They understand they need that heading into the sprint to November. As you said, she performed well in the debate. It was largely rated well. And they understand they need to pull on all levers here to make a difference in what is fundamentally still a dead heat. And they know that the debate helped, but it didn't satisfy questions voters have about some of her policy, how she would distinguish herself from Biden on some of the issues like border and the economy, which is a huge issue for, some of those young voters that we're talking about that she really absolutely needs to turn out. So I think you're going to see them grind on, some of the messaging we've seen from her campaign is that early voting has already started. We should see them, try and keep the organization motivated, keep the pressure on Trump, and just try and reach those undecided and persuadable voters with the aim of just moving the numbers a tenth of percentage points in their direction in the run up to November.
Yeah, because that's where we're at in terms of the closeness of everything. You're exactly right. Tolu, we mentioned Trump was in North Carolina yesterday, Pennsylvania tomorrow, two key swing states. Tell us how important those two states are for Trump, and what do you make of the controversy with the Republican nominee for governor?
Yeah, if Trump loses both of those states, there's not really a pathway for him to win the presidency. And so he is trying to double down on those sort of East Coast states. It's sort of an eastern wall compared to the Midwest wall of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, that has long been the blue wall for Democrats. He's trying to build a wall of Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. If he wins those states, he has a pretty good chance of winning the election. But those states are dead heats, and it's very clear that the situation in North Carolina is not one that is helping former President Trump. He endorsed Mark Robinson, the lieutenant governor there, who's running for governor. He has backed him. He's said positive things about him all along the way. And he is very responsible for his rise and his ability to become the Republican nominee for governor. And now that he's facing this lewd scandal, it's very difficult for Donald Trump to go to North Carolina and not have that scandal follow him. Yesterday, when he was in North Carolina, Mark Robinson was nowhere to be found. He was not on stage as he normally when Trump is in a state at a rally. And so it's very clear that Trump is trying to distance himself from Robinson. But if Robinson loses by double digits, it's hard to see Trump being competitive in that state.
And back to you, Courtney, on Kamala Harris in Georgia and Wisconsin this weekend. One thing that she was talking about, we played it a little bit earlier, reproductive rights, obviously a big issue for Democrats. But I wonder what you're listening for in terms of how she shapes that message going forward.
Yeah, a senior campaign advisor told me that they understand their messaging on abortion is part of the reason that got them to this point, right? So, they want to continue the discipline on emphasizing this as a central issue to the election, underline Trump's abortion record, particularly his appointment of 3 Supreme Court justices who helped overturn Roe v. Wade that led to some of these state abortion bans, and really just emphasize the life-threatening risks of some of these state laws on women. And I think you'll continue to see that.
Tolu, we talked a lot about endorsements over the past couple of weeks, mostly because of Taylor Swift, frankly. But the International Brotherhood of Teamsters say they won't endorse the presidential candidate, though they did endorse Joe Biden. What should we make of that decision? They just don't want to get tied up into the politics anymore?
Well, they did a poll of their members, and surprisingly for many, Trump was the faraway favorite among the members of the Teamsters. And so it was difficult for them to come out in favor of Kamala Harris when they had done a similar poll of the race when it was Joe Biden versus Trump. The members were in favor of Biden. And so it is a bit of a red flag for the Kamala Harris campaign to know that union members, specifically in this union, are not in favor of her campaign, and they're listening to Donald Trump and seeing in him someone that they could cast their votes for. In states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, where you have a large union population, their vote could swing the race. And so Kamala Harris is trying to improve her numbers, trying to reach out to members of the union community and try to show that she can be a president for them. But those numbers right now are not in favor of her. And that endorsement is one that she definitely wanted.
Yeah, that should be a red flag for them for sure. Courtney, just last one to you. We've been talking up in this country about politicians and some safety issues, not on the same level, obviously, of what is it being experienced there. 2 assassination attempts on Donald Trump and the Secret Service saying they have to change how they're dealing with things. How is that going over in Washington? The fact that this has happened twice and that there need to be changes.
It's one of the few overwhelmingly bipartisan issues currently in Washington. There's wholesale agreement that the Secret Service needs more funding and resources to protect candidates, especially Trump. And there's a bipartisan task force in Congress looking into the issue. So lawmakers are, trying to figure out how they can quickly add funding to a stopgap spending bill they're considering next week to keep the government running, and, how they can use any new dollars in the next few weeks between now and Election Day. But it's not just a funding issue. A report this week found that the agency failed to use technology to detect the attacker and flaws in planning and communication. So there's going to be a lot of pressure in the coming weeks on the agency. And I think next week's United Nations General Assembly will be a key test on whether they're able to address some of these issues.
Toluse, Olorunnipa, Courtney, Subramanian. I'm so lucky and grateful to have two very smart people with me on this program for this country. Thank you. Have a great Sunday to both of you.
Thanks.